It's been over a dozen years since the September 11th terror attacks. The American taxpayer has been bilked for trillions of dollars in an endless war on terror. Isn't it time that we find out the real perpetrators behind this attack? Stick around for Buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as...
Christopher Berlin used to be an investigative journalist for the American Free Press, and more recently has written 2 books on solving 9/11. He's joining me today to discuss perhaps who the real suspects should be in investigating that crime. Christopher, thank you for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
To start out, I think we have to ask the basic question, which is, I get asked that as well. Why do you believe that 9/11 is not what the mainstream media and the 9/11 Commission tells us to believe as a Al-Qaeda conspiracy perpetrated by 19 terrorist hijackers on airplanes, 4 airplanes that day?
Well, it's very simple. First, that the crime of 9/11, in which 3,000 people were killed, was never really investigated as a crime. The evidence was destroyed, for example, the steel at Ground Zero, and what evidence that was remaining was not analyzed. So the person who was supposed to prosecute the crimes of 9/11 was Michael Chertoff, Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. And the FBI was supposed to provide him with the analysis of the evidence to prosecute the crimes. None of that ever happened. Rather, the steel from the World Trade Center was sent to a couple of junkyards in New Jersey, cut into small pieces, mixed with other scrap, and sent to China. And it was sent to China at a time when the price of scrap steel was the lowest it had been in 50 years, which meant that just the cost of shipping it to China was eating up all their profit. So this was a crime in which the evidence was destroyed, and that was done because an analysis of the evidence would have proven early on what we now know, that the buildings were exploded, the buildings were demolished with explosions, and that the perpetrators were not the Arabs on the airplanes, but the buildings themselves were wired for destruction. And 93% of the people who died on 9/11 died in the Twin Towers.
Well, so you said, for example, that there was a profit to be made by selling the scrap. Now, who exactly? Was that the owners of the Trade Center buildings that would make profit on that?
Well, they called it recycling. And at the time it was going on in 2001 and 2002, the New York media pretended not to understand basically the chain of custody of who was in control of the evidence. But the evidence was first and foremost under the control of the Department of Justice and their sub-agency, the FBI. And John Ashcroft was Attorney General. His assistant was Michael Chertoff, an Israeli national, by the way. And so these people failed in their official duties to prosecute the crimes because they failed in investigating the crime. There was no investigation. So when you talk about the 9/11 Commission report, or you talk about these building performance documents, these reports, these do not replace an official police investigation, a forensic investigation, which never happened. So the destruction of the evidence is itself a crime. And for that crime, you could hold John Ashcroft, Michael Chertoff, and of course George Bush and Dick Cheney accountable because they served beneath him, beneath the government.
Mm-hmm. So now we start with that question, obviously, being, okay, if the people that are supposed to be investigating this are not properly investigating it, does that indicate then a level of collusion?
Exactly.
Now, my question then would be, at what point, I mean, you're at this point a journalist, at what point do you start to say things are not unfolding properly to my, to my understanding, to my knowledge, my awareness of how the world should work, that there's something else going on here, that there's perhaps a conspiracy at work? At what point does that come into your head?
I understood that in the first week. I was in New York City on September 11th, early in the morning. I couldn't go to Washington, obviously, so we turned around and went back across Pennsylvania. And as I started writing about it, when I got back to Chicago a couple days later, I could see that the government and the media were avoiding 2 main things. They were avoiding the evidence of explosions in the World Trade Center, and they were ignoring and omitting any discussion of these 5 dancing Israelis. And then these are the guys, these Israeli agents who were caught basically celebrating the collapse, the burning towers behind them in New Jersey. And then thirdly, about a week later, there came out this report about the instant messaging services of Odigo. It's an Israeli company that was based in Herzliya, Israel, and also near the World Trade Center. And some instant messages went out on this text messaging service, Israeli-owned, that warned of an imminent catastrophe at the World Trade Center, and it was sent out about 2 hours before it actually happened. So like 6:45 local time, 6:30. But the thing is that the vice president of the company in Israel, Alex Diamandis, he told the media that the warnings were exact, precise to the minute, meaning that at 8:45, all hell is going to break loose at the World Trade Center. Don't go there. So those things in the first 2 weeks indicated to me that there was a cover-up, that we were being told a false narrative, we were being given a false narrative, and that those were the main issues that were being omitted from discussion.
Right. But that question about the text message service, I mean, was that proven, or was, because obviously a lot of mainstream media says, oh, that was some, conspiracy rumor, anti-Semitic rumors that were spread about.
No, that was printed in the New York Times, I think, and maybe in the Washington Post once, but then later in Haaretz in Israel. And like I said, the vice president of the company, Alex Diamandis, spoke to Haaretz, I believe it was, and said exactly what I just told you, that the warnings were precise to the minute.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've had Juval Aviv, for example, right, who was Mossad. He, formerly Mossad, he told me that he had been with George Bush briefing him, especially at that time period. He was briefing the president on a monthly basis, as he says. And he basically had briefed him a month in advance about precisely this type of attack unfolding. Now, his claim, of course, was that Bush didn't, heard it, really didn't take it seriously, or who knows what happened. I mean, he would say that there was perhaps a shadow government at play. I won't speak for him. But the point being that intelligence services were aware of the plots taking place. Now, where do you think Mossad fits into this scheming of this event?
Well, I use the term Mossad to refer to Israeli intelligence in general, but it's a loose use of the term, because an atrocity like 9/11 was planned. We now know it was planned decades in advance, and the first indications and projections, ideations of this idea came out, for example, in a movie by Arnon Milchan in 1978 called The Medusa Touch, with Richard Burton, in which the climactic scene is a 747 flying into the Pan Am building. And then, you find that at every point of the matrix, you find either an Israeli agent themselves or a Sayan, an American Jew who's working for the state of Israel. And what we're talking about is a very extreme bunch of people at the top of Israeli intelligence and Israeli military, like Netanyahu, who basically have a psychopathic version of the worldview. And you have to understand that in Israel, in 1976, I think it was, the Likud coalition came to power. When the Likud coalition came to power, it basically brought the terrorist gangs of the 1940s into the top of the government. And it was a very sad day in Israeli history, because it brought these former terrorists like Begin, Shamir, and of course Ariel Sharon into power. And these are people who only know the use of terrorism. That's their modus operandi. And so, when 2001 began, February, we had Ariel Sharon running Israel and George Bush running this country. It was a constellation made for disaster.
I mean, we've had Paul Craig Roberts on this show, who was former assistant Treasury Secretary under Reagan, and he talks about the neocon faction. And he said, look, I mean, these neocons, who obviously, a lot of whom are actually joint Israeli U.S. citizens, right? This bunch were basically being, they were imprisoned for their crimes during the Iran-Contra era under the first Bush, right? When Bush was running that operation as vice president, and then as president, he was able to pardon a lot of these guys, right? Guys like Poindexter and Abrams. But the point being that this same crew that's running operations in the 80s is now all of a sudden given another carte blanche access to the presidency through Bush Jr., Part 2.
Precisely. And Ariel Sharon was the Israeli defense minister when they invaded Lebanon in 1982. And the atrocity of the massacre in Sabra and Shatila was blamed on him by a commission in Israel, the Kahana Commission. And the Kahane Commission recommended that he lose his portfolio as Minister of Defense, which was taken away. And they also recommended that he never serve in an Israeli government again. But in 2001, he was elected. And, you know, we saw what Ariel Sharon was all about when he went up on the Temple Dome with a bunch of soldiers and basically started an intifada. He started an uprising all by himself. Because this is a man who thrives on terrorism and tension and war. And that's basically that's who's been running Israel since 1976, basically, is these people. And, you know, Menachem Begin, who was the founder of the Likud party, who took Israel into the war in Lebanon, was also the person who bombed the King David Hotel in July 1946. And that's very similar to 9/11 because the reason they bombed the King David Hotel is because it was British headquarters in Mandate, Palestine. And the British had gone out on an operation and collected a lot of evidence and previous to that. And they had information that would have hanged the leaders of the Yishuv, the leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Zionist Committee. And even the Jewish Agency was implicated in the evidence. So they had to destroy the King David Hotel in order to destroy the evidence.
Right.
And they have the same thing on 9/11. You have the destruction, for example, of Building 6, the Customs House, where the vault down below the building, where all the evidence from the Enron crime and the WorldCom and various gold financial scandals and just all kinds of things like that, big crimes that were being investigated by the federal government, that evidence was carted off the night before. As we know from Kurt Sonnenfeld, who was a videographer for FEMA, the vault was empty. And Building 6 has a giant crater in the middle of it. It's an 8-story building, but it has a giant crater that goes down to the sub-basement level. And the New York Fire Department was trying to fight that fire and contain that fire before the towers even fell. So you see, when you talk about 9/11, you're talking about a crime within a crime within a crime. Very much like those Russian Matryoshka dolls, where you open up the doll, there's another doll inside, another doll. It's the same way. There's layers of deception, and there's crimes within crimes.
So you mentioned, obviously, this film, you know, that was Milchan produced. Ironically enough, he's won the Oscars the last 2 years in a row. And that actually happened after he admitted to being a notorious arms dealer who helped the Israelis to secure the nuclear bomb. Right? That confession occurred, and then all of a sudden he wins 2 Oscars. But his film dealt with a terror attack and a plane hitting a Pan Am building. But how does that, in a sense, you say it's a precursor or in a sense a foreshadowing of 9/11, but at what point do you think this attack was staged and, as you say, for covering up what crimes? Like what was the intention of the cover-up there?
Well, they had to have the cover-up because in such an atrocity there are 3 levels that have to be controlled. You have to control the investigation, you have to control the interpretation, and you have to control the litigation. So the first one is you have to control the access to the evidence. Because if proper investigative forensic examiners were able to access the steel of the World Trade Center, like the steel of the World Trade Center, this is a place where about 2,700 people died, more or less. But 93% of all the people who died on 9/11 died in those buildings. But that's the crime scene where all those people died. It was literally an American Holocaust because they were being cooked alive above those crash zones. The people who were trapped above the crash zones were being cooked alive, which is why so many jumped. But had that steel evidence been properly preserved and stored someplace and made available for a thorough investigation, then the true nature of the collapse would have been revealed early on. And that would have blown the whole thing out of the water because, as we now know, nanothermite was found in the dust. Basically, all that was left of the World Trade Center after 9/11 was dust and steel. Okay, the U.S. government did some little survey of the dust, and they found that all the dust contained tiny droplets of molten iron, basic little balls of iron. Well, where did that come from? That doesn't fit into the official version in any way, because there's no way that iron could be made molten in a crash scenario like they presented in their books. So, and then the interpretation, we were given a false interpretation of what happened on 9/11 by Ehud Barak, Israel's former defense minister and prime minister. He was in the London studios of the BBC World before the towers even fell. And he was giving this explanation. He said, the world will never be the same from today on. He said, we know who's behind this. It's basically, he says, it's Osama bin Laden. And we know where he is. And he said, now is the time for America to engage in an operational war on terrorism. And that little spiel that he gave on world television, BBC World, then became basically the takeaway from the whole thing. That's what everybody then believed from then on. That was the Israeli interpretation of 9/11.
It was there. I mean, it was what PNAC was calling for. The Project for a New American Century was calling for. Right. We need to basically take. We have to basically take onus of becoming the modern empire to secure the world, the world's policeman. We need a real Pearl Harbor, a new Pearl Harbor to justify it.
Precisely.
I mean, that's obviously the narrative of the war on terror. But for you saying going back, you know, for let's say a decade or two, in terms of the motivation for this target, for these buildings, because again, we can say like, yes, destroying the World Trade Center has triggered the war on terror to the present day, where we're concerned about ISIS terrorists that have only cropped up because of the war in Iraq and against Syria, and you name it. Like, we're just in endless wars now. But the point being that why the Trade Center buildings? Why these three? Especially World Trade Center 7, because that one didn't even get hit by a plane, and they still demolished it. So something must have been in there that they wanted to cover up.
Well, yeah, the OEM, the Office of Emergency Management, New York City, they had a hardened bunker on the 23rd floor. The entire 23rd floor was a hardened bunker with resistance to every nuclear blast, even. I mean, basically, and that, I think, is probably where the people who pushed the buttons on 9/11 that caused the demolition of the towers, they probably worked out of there. Then afterwards they had to destroy the evidence again. But the thing is that in 1979, the founding head of Mossad, his name was Isser Harel. In 1979, he predicted to an American visitor, a Zionist mercenary, what do you call evangelist, a TV evangelist, named Stephen Evans, or Michael Evans. He told him that in 1979, he said Arab terrorism would come to America. And when it does, they will attack your tallest building in New York City, because he said for the Arabs that's like a symbol of your fertility. And he made that prediction in 1979, and 22 years later it came true. And in my book Solving 9/11, I go to the historical. I start from the history, and I explain how Israel has done this kind of thing before. I explain the motivation. I explain also how they were setting up the crime.
Well, you talk about false flags, for example, how they've, are notorious for being able to create sort of, whether it be the Palestinians, for example, creating terrorist groups or networks that may either ultimately, like Hamas, for example, many people say was originally, in a sense, not necessarily seeded from Israel, but they did allow Hamas to operate out of Israel proper, right? And
ISIS or ISIL or IS, Islamic State, it's. For example, all the videos we're seeing now, well, first of all, false flag terrorism has now become the new norm. After 9/11, that's the seminal event of our time. But afterwards, like the recent events in Denmark and in Paris and in Kenya, and many of these attacks, most of these attacks are more of the same, false flag terrorism. And so what I recommend to your viewers, is that they read Jean le Carré's book, The Little Drummer Girl. Because in that book, it was written with the help of the Mossad. They explain in the 1980s exactly how Israel sets up such things like the Paris shooting or the Danish shooting, and how they do it. And 9/11. I mean, for example, the 6 or 7 of the so-called Arab terrorists who were living in Florida all had duplicate licenses issued in their name. You see? So somebody else was going around town leaving a trail in their name. And that's what Little Drummer Girl is all about, how they do that kind of thing. And because, now when we see Islamic State committing atrocities week after week, day after day, what's interesting to note is that all of the videos, the video evidence, is coming out of one little Israeli website called Site Intelligence Group. I think it's based in McLean, Virginia. And the woman who runs it is named Rita Katz. And she was on CNN when the second American beheading video was shown on TV. She told on CNN, she explained that it just so happens that we aired this film before the group aired the film, because we had a copy beforehand. Well, how did they have a copy beforehand?
Good question. So where do the Saudis fit into this? Because, I mean, apparently, according to the 28 missing pages for the 9/11 Commission, there's Saudi financing that's going into the operation. Where would they fit into the 9/11 operation?
Well, with all due respect for the Saudis, I would have to say they're kind of like useful idiots. They've been played. They may also be, of course, willing to go along with some of these things because
I don't think they would oppose. I don't think the Wahhabist mentality would really object to the use of terrorism to
right,
spread their ideology.
they are supporting, as we know, they are supporting Islamic State. They are supporting these mercenaries and these rebels that are fighting in Syria.
Going back to the Taliban in the 80s, right?
Yeah, and they are, they're dead set against Iran and Hezbollah and the Shiites. So, but the Saudis, when you talk about those 28 pages, I don't know what those 28 pages say, but when they talk about Saudi involvement in 9/11, that is not consistent with all of the information that I have found, is that at the architectural level of this crime and the managerial level of this crime, the people who ran it, thought about it, conceived it, and then managed it, they're all Zionists, not Saudis. So, as I said, the Saudis were probably played or used or just useful idiots who were able to be snookered into a position where they look indictable.
Right.
Like they look culpable.
Well, but I think even above the Zionist level, you still have what's the British Empire,
Yeah.
which is still a tactical, how do you say, it's a tactical machine.
Yeah.
The British Empire is the one that formed Israel in the first place, is the one that created the Saudi Arabia, because Arabia obviously was not under Saudi control before the British gave it to them.
Right.
It, basically established the modern Middle East. And so they're tremendous architects, going back to Bernard Lewis and his arc of crisis policy in the late 70s, right, that Brzezinski bought into when they formulated the Afghan war against the Soviets, right? The idea we can use this radical Islam against, this is historical British policy, against any kind of sovereign nation state, be it USSR, be it China, be it Assad now in Syria, or Nasser and Sadat in Egypt before, right? So it's a very, to me, it's a British imperial policy that plays well into the Zionist, let's say, worldview.
But when you look at the British imperial policy, you have to look at who's behind that imperial policy, and you do find the fingerprints of the Rothschild family, for example. The Balfour Declaration, which created the state of Palestine, it was basically like the birth certificate for the nation in 1917, was addressed to Lord Rothschild.
Yes.
And the Rothschilds, they had their own interest there. They wanted to create this Jewish state. They wanted to protect the Suez Canal, which they had invested in and owned. But it's when we talk about the British Empire, who exactly are we talking about? That's what I'm pointing out. Because the British have been snookered in the same way that we've been snookered into wars in the Middle East that are not in our national interest. And it's not in Britain's national interest either.
Well, again, that's the problem with empire. You lose your national interest when you become an empire, right? That's the whole point, is that you get caught up in these games that really destroy your nation, your industrial policies, for example, that might raise your working class. That all gets destroyed in the process of building.
But you have to look at who is the brain behind the empire. Like, for example, now we have this Ukraine crisis. Well, how did we get into this Ukraine crisis? We got into it because of the actions of Nuland, Victoria Nuland. She's married to Mr. Robert Kagan. Who brought us the war in Iraq, basically. The PNAC document you referred to that said that the United States should invade and occupy Iraq whether Saddam Hussein is on the throne or not. That was in 2000, right? Well, now she comes along and she's the one who brought us the crisis in Kiev. She supported it, and then she said
they had been pumping billions into the
and two weeks before the government was overthrown, the elected government was overthrown, she was already naming who would be the prime minister.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like this is not an American empire. This is an American empire with a foreign brain, if you will, with a foreign agenda at the top. So it's very destructive of our nation. It's destructive of everything this nation stands for. And we are enslaved. We are enslaved to that deception that began on 9/11. And if we don't free ourselves from the deception of 9/11, if we don't understand that this is all based on deception, then we will remain enslaved to it. And that, it means nothing good for us. Those people that died on 9/11, there were thousands of people who died, 3,000 people died. More and more will die as a result if we don't free ourselves. It's in our absolute best interest as a nation that we expose who's really behind 9/11 and bring them to account. Justice. And I'm encouraged by the fact that Minister Farrakhan in Chicago, Nation of Islam, has started speaking out about the Israeli role in 9/11, because he's the first high-profile religious leader to talk about it. You know, all of our institutions have failed us. The media, the government, the police, the universities, the churches. I wrote a letter to the Pope. I told the Pope, you just have to tell the people that we've been deceived about 9/11. That's all. I mean, how can the churches go along with this deception? The deception is killing us. How can they go along with it?
Well, I would argue that don't forget that the Catholic Church also has a tremendous role and influence, because Israel itself sits where the Crusader kingdom used to sit.
Yeah.
So to me, actually, a lot of this policy is being foisted by a much older empire, which is called the Roman Catholic Empire. You know, and again, I don't look at it like a Zionist influence over the British. I think the British have a much older game that they play, and they've used Zionism as one of their tools, just like they've used fanatical Islam, just like they've used, you know, our war parties. It's like, again, it's a game as old as empire.
Yeah.
But to get back to the real
Sure.
motivation behind 9/11, in terms of the towers.
Yeah.
So the target, again, being what exactly do you think in those three towers? Because we know, for example, that, you know, Euro Brokers and Marsh McLennan were two of the companies that lost over 500 people
Right.
out of a 3,000 people dying.
Right.
To lose that number of employees indicates perhaps those were the marks
Yeah.
and the targets. But why?
Yeah, well, you know, one thing is that, as I said before, evidence of crimes, evidence of the big crimes of the 1990s was being destroyed systematically. As we know, Rumsfeld came on TV on the day before 9/11 and said something like $2 trillion was unaccountable for from the defense budget. And then, you know, the missile...
Dov Zakheim was the controller that
Yeah,
day, for
Dov
example.
Zakheim was the controller, and then the plane that hit the Pentagon went into, or the missile, went directly into the accounting office where that money was being, you know, sought, looked for. So...
The books.
Yeah, the books. And the same thing, like, both airplanes went into secure computer rooms in the Twin Towers. As you said, Marsh McLennan went right into their computer room, the first one. But that brings up a whole other thing, because when we talk about Marsh McLennan, we're talking about Maurice Greenberg and Jules Kroll. And Jules Kroll Associates, had control of the security for the building, you know? And Jerome Hauer had worked for them. Jerome Hauer then appeared on TV in San Diego on the morning of 9/11, again blaming Osama bin Laden.
Right, like the script was already written.
The script was written, absolutely.
Yeah.
And when Philip Zelikow then was executive director of the 9/11 Commission report, he came to the beginning of the planning sessions with the myth already written out. He's a myth maker, basically. That was his specialty in college. He wrote his thesis was the creation and maintenance of the public myth. And then he gave us a myth, he wrote the myth, and all those bullet points, all of those points and titles and subtitles of that myth were already on paper before the people even started talking. So you see, that's...
So you mentioned Maurice Greenberg, who's AIG, right? And AIG
Yes.
people know from the financial debacle in 2008. But AIG has a long history with CIA and other covert operations, because the insurance always has to come into play at some point.
Yes.
In our world, what's their role? Do you think the AIG factor in this whole thing?
Well, it's not so much AIG. I don't know. It's more Maurice Greenberg. Maurice Greenberg is a very big supporter of the State of Israel, and as Jules Kroll is, and you know, we saw in 2008 AIG received a $180 billion bailout from his AIG were insuring basically Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. So the money went to AIG and then to Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. But the thing is that, you know, the secure computer room of both Fuji Bank in the South Tower and Marsh McLennan in the North Tower, these computer rooms played a role. They were obviously, from the picture, you know, behind you, you can see that the computer rooms basically exploded and left a huge, big, giant trail of white smoke. Well, that does not fit with burning kerosene. That is evidence of thermite. And so, my book, 9/11, I look at the history of Israeli false flag terrorism, the history of Israeli attacks on American and British targets, and then the crime itself, and the setting up of the crime, and then the cover-up of the crime. Right. The cover-up is the ongoing crime. You see, 9/11 is an ongoing crime. The crime happened on September 11, 2001. But ever since then, they've been maintaining this web of deception around it and basing policy on that deception.
Oh, I mean, that's the one thing that they've done very well, obviously, is by once you stage an event, as you say, a false flag terror event, you have to immediately declare war. Because by diverting the attention to the other enemy, you never have time to stop and actually assess the original crime to say, wait a minute, this was a false flag from the beginning.
Precisely. And why did Bush and Cheney not commission a blue ribbon investigation panel on day one? That is their crime. You know, they should have started investigating this if it were truly a crime that we didn't know who did it, and we had no part of, or our government had no part of it. Then they would have begun the investigation that day.
Right.
And they would have pulled out all the stops and found out who was behind this and what happened.
Yeah.
But the fact that they didn't do that indicates that it was a cover-up from the very beginning.
You talked to Andreas von Bülow in
Yeah.
writing this book. Now describe a little bit just of who he is and what
Yeah.
his conclusion was.
Well, he was, I was writing these articles in my little home in Schaumburg, Illinois, in September, October, and November of 2001, as the country was going to war. And I saw that the government and the media were giving us this really false narrative, and all the evidence that contradicted that was being swept under the table. And they're going to war on that. And I said, how safe can it be for me to be here? So we went to Germany. I transferred and started working as a foreign correspondent in Germany after Thanksgiving in 2001. And the first person I met in Germany was basically Andreas von Bülow. I met him at his house. And he was the former German parliamentarian who was in charge of the budgets for the intelligence agencies in Germany. And I spoke to three people like him. And they all told me that it looked like a Hollywood deception. They couldn't understand why a blue ribbon investigation wasn't happening. And Andreas von Bülow explained to me that in this kind of operation, there's an architectural level, a managerial level, and a working level. And the working level is part of the deception. So like the 19 Arabs, for example, who were on the planes or not on the planes, whatever, the false trail of these 19 Arabs, that is the one part of the deception. But the managerial level, you would find people like Alvin K. Hellerstein, the judge in New York, who oversaw the tort litigation, in which all 3,000 cases were settled out of court. There will never be a 9/11 trial. All the victims' families were settled out of court. Even the 100 families that held out for a trial, they were all settled out of court.
Right.
And of course, Michael Chertoff, he's the head cop. How do you sue the head cop? But in any case, he was the guy who was supposed to prosecute the crime. There was no 9/11 trial. There never will be.
Right.
Because if there were a trial, there would be legal discovery. And we could ask questions like, how did these guys get on the plane? Did they get on the plane? Let's see the videos, et cetera, et cetera.
What happened to the Pentagon video?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think I have to urge people to read your book. I think that there's much more information in there, but this is a good place to leave it. And, you know, I know that you're out of the country now because of some of the intimidation you face as a result of your research.
Malicious prosecution. I was attacked by undercover police at my house and then maliciously prosecuted. And but the reason we left is because there simply wasn't enough support for 9/11 truth at that time.
Right.
But now there is. It's growing. And people are realizing that we are still stuck in this deception.
Yes.
And if we don't free ourselves from it, the future will be grimmer than the past. It'll be worse.
I think it's becoming more and more apparent that this game goes on until people can actually just, you know, call a spade,
right,
and stop buying the BS.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, Christopher. Appreciate it. Well, there you have it, folks. A little slice into 9/11 reality. Let's hope that you check out Solving 9/11 and start to realize that the events of that day were not as they appeared on the TV screen. That was a tremendous magic trick that was played so that we can be in this endless war of continuous militarization of not only abroad, but also domestically. And it will carry on until we start to actually call out the criminals, the real terrorists that perpetrated it. This is Sean Stone signing off.